Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Opt-in podcast. I'm very excited this week because not only is it the first week with a guest, the very first one, it is with a new friend that I met in January. So I want to welcome Becca to the podcast and to our little community we're growing here. So welcome, Becca.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I love the podcast.
She's a raving fan, so we've gotta love having her on here for that reason alone. And Becca and I met actually just in January. So as of this recording, if you're listening to this somewhere far in the future, it is the very beginning of April 2023. And Becca and I were in a 3-day training together. Perfect strangers, didn't know each other, and then the universe threw us together, and we got to do some role play and be in a small group over the course of a couple of days. And that's where I got to see Becca's passion for the topic that we're going to talk about today really come to life. So Becca, why don't you introduce yourself to the community, and then we'll get started.
Okay, cool. Well, Melissa, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. We're talking about employee engagement. Spoiler alert. My background is in human resources. So I'm an HR professional for about 12 years now. So relatively young in my career, but definitely have found a point of interest, a passion area, and have some good expertise in that. So I've worked in human resources for, over a decade. Most of that, about half of that was in recruitment and talent acquisition. And then the other half has been kind of finding this niche area in really just the employee experience, people programs, measuring employee experience, and creating great cultures where people want to work and stay. So that's me.
Well, we're very excited to have you. And I want to start because I think this is always such an interesting part of the journey. So how did you decide that HR was the place for you and that's where you wanted to grow your career? How did you make that choice? Did you know from the day you started college that that's what you wanted to do, or did something else happen along the way?
Good question. I definitely did not know the day I started college. In fact, when I started college, I knew that business was kind of an area of interest. In the business school at the college I went to, Ohio State University, was in good standing, like a good reputation. I knew it would be a good choice for me. I had thought about doing marketing actually as kind of a area of focus specialization, but my mom has a decades and decades long career in HR. And I got to join her at work a couple of times. And in doing so, really like some interactions stood out to me. So she was an HR executive in healthcare, which has been where all of my HR experience has been, actually in the healthcare environment. And it doesn't really matter, I don't think, what area of what industry, when it comes to human resources and really, I think, leadership in general. And around the guide culture circles, we like to say it doesn't really matter what role you're in or what industry you're in. Your work is about people, and in one way or another. And so just seeing my mom's interactions with people, like employees, and seeing the way that they knew her and she just was able to show care for them, and build relationships with them. And I thought, wow, if this is what human resources is, getting to know people and supporting them, that's really of interest to me. So I declared that as my specialization, probably a couple of months into college, but definitely was starting out just, not sure what area of business that would take me.
And now that you're, on the other side of it and have been doing the work for a while, you found your sweet spot or your passion project, which is employee engagement, as you talked about at the top of the show. And you and I have had a couple of offline conversations about it, and I've got a strong perspective that people don't actually really know what that means. So leadership loves to stand up and say, we're running these employee engagement programs and this is what it's going to do. And everybody walks out of those town halls and goes, I'm not really sure what what they're trying to achieve. So what's your definition of employee engagement?
when you Google employee engagement, there are a number of ways to describe it. To me, I think it's way more simple than what people might realize. It's really a measuring of someone's experience at work. And I also really believe that employee engagement, I kind of hate the term like employee engagement because I really just think that we're talking about people engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Employee engagement, these principles and concepts, they're not just, I don't believe that they're just limited to the workplace. I actually feel like they apply to any organization where you're trying to get people to stay, where you're trying to get people to be enthusiastic and involved and willing to give of their effort. That to me is what employee engagement is. Loyalty, commitment, and willingness to give of their discretionary effort. And I think that applies to a lot of places: students, schools, organizations, volunteers, churches. So it being just about the workplace and being employee engagement, I think is something that I kind of differ on in terms of my opinion. Oh, and when you look at articles, they're mostly about like workplace staff and staff leader relationships, but I just feel like there's a lot of other relationships where these principles can apply. That's my definition.
It's a good one. And I can remember reading countless books and even hearing podcasts and people that speak on the importance of leadership always say that culture is defined by what people do when nobody's watching, right? And you talked a little bit just now around how people choose to behave or take action based on the environment that they're in. And so would it be fair to say that employee engagement or engagement of humankind, as it will, in any good work is really our free will to choose to take our energy and our effort and put it towards the mission for wherever we stand?
Totally. I completely agree with that. And I think a part of employee engagement is also that the promotion, like the promotion of it and the inviting other people along with it. So it is like our internal energy and enthusiasm for ourselves, but also that like inviting people along, adding to the group. Yeah.
So based on your experience, if there's the opportunity for leaders or maybe even the collective employee base to be inviting others along, where do you see, because this podcast is all about spilling all the secrets and telling all the things behind the scenes, where do you see companies take missteps with trying to promote employee engagement or employee engagement tools and metrics in the workforce?
Something that comes to mind as a barrier to really asking for feedback, using that feedback about what people are experiencing, where in your sphere of influence, whether you're a frontline leader, an executive leader, or leading an organization of students or volunteers. When it's a clunky process, like when the system is too complex for anyone for it to be challenging to gather that feedback or challenging to then look at what that data is saying, challenging to do anything with it, I think that's a real barrier. I've seen that firsthand, and that is not the point. That is not the point of measuring engagement of a people group, is that it's too difficult to even deal with the data, analyze it, collect it. So the complexities or the complications can be a problem. And then I also think that it really needs to be something that everyone's bought into. A personal belief of mine when it comes to engagement, people engagement. That's a new term I'm coining here, is people engagement.
It is. You better go trademark that, Becca.
I know. People engagement. It's really what it is. But what I wanted to say is I see it really as a two-way responsibility. So oftentimes I think the perspective sometimes is that it's just something that's only beneficial to leaders, or it's something that they have to do, or, it's this buzzword that people know we should probably be doing something with that. And certainly, like, it is a buzzword, and I'm glad that people are recognizing that engaging people is an important and worthwhile thing for us to be spending time and resources doing. I think that's critical. What I really would like to see, as far as removing barriers and challenges, and just some of the things that I think have sometimes given employee engagement as this like formal term that people don't really understand, is, to me, it's just a conversation. It's a conversation about understanding what you're experiencing as an employee. It's also the opportunity for the employee or the person, like, they have a responsibility to share. I get that sometimes there's some concern about, levels. There's varying levels of comfort, I think, in doing that. But doing what you can to have an honest conversation, and really just giving, I think, generous assumptions. So when I'm someone taking, responding to someone's request for feedback, whether that's about my experience or otherwise, being really generous with the assumptions that I'm giving when I'm being asked to provide that. That's a great opportunity for me to be able to share. Wow, so nice that you would even care to be asking me about my experience. And also, when I think one of the things that can become a frustration and sort of give like kind of a negative, I don't know, maybe people are just kind of burned out on the term, or sort of have this negative perception of it, is that nothing, like, it doesn't matter. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever changes. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, I hate that is probably true in some organizations. My goal is for that to not be the case. And I think that's the goal of a lot of leaders, and probably your listeners, I think, on this podcast, who are people managers, or might see a future for them doing that. But yeah, my point is just, I think that when it's just seen as a conversation, and even though it may not always be done perfectly, if you're given the opportunity to share, and if you're being asked for that, I think that's really valuable, and I think that means something. So yeah, that's a roundabout way to answer your question, I think. But
no, you had some really good points though, and one of the ones I want to drill into a little bit, because you used the word a few times, is when you're invited to have a conversation, you should really engage in that. And being a leader of a large team of people at one point in the recent past, I can vividly remember having either completely virtual, because we were in a pandemic for a while, or in person and everybody was in the room together, sessions to have those conversations. And there was a lot of silence, and hesitancy to engage in the conversation. So if anybody here is either planning to have these conversations or even inviting people into the room and you're participating in one, what advice would you have for people in a way to engage and provide feedback, or make just the overall conversation more comfortable? What have you seen in your experience that works really well?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind is clear expectations about what happens after the feedback is shared. Like, what are we doing with this? And that was, as I was thinking about what have I seen work well, is a defined, like, action planning process, and that's something that we're all participating in. So, my experience thus far has been in a pretty large organization with lots of teams, 14,000 plus employees. And so these are conversations that mostly frontline leaders are having with their staff. And I like a defined, just, we know what we're doing here, and we know what's going to be done with the information that's shared. I think it's important that leaders are equipped well for those conversations. So having resources to help them with that, that's really critical. I know that, again, varying levels of comfort, I think, in terms of having those types of discussions. Um, so resources that support leaders in doing that, I think, is really important. One thing that I would say is, I mean, just even like having that opportunity to have a conversation and invite team members, whether or not they respond, which I hope that this podcast might encourage individual contributors to take those opportunities to share in constructive ways, of course. I think one thing that would want to remind managers and leaders is that if you don't invite that conversation, you are still communicating something. So even though you might get response of silence, what might be going on inside of your team members, in their heart and in their mind is at least what I'm taking away is that I had an opportunity to share. So, I can't be upset that maybe something didn't change if I didn't speak up about it or provide solutions for it. So I guess that's just an encouragement to leaders to say, if you're met with silence or if you're met with, a lack of maybe collaboration and coming up with solutions for problems or ways to improve things, that's okay. You opened up the floor to offer that. And so, I've also seen like some creative ways to do that to solicit that feedback from people or to have a discussion about it. Many of the leaders at the healthcare organization that I worked for a long time have hundreds of direct reports. They have an entire emergency room department of people on numerous shifts, and they don't necessarily have a time where they can all gather together and have an in-person conversation. So creative ways to gather that and almost kind of like vote on things or propose solutions through whether that's email. Some of them have Facebook groups. I've seen they use like a post-it notes, like on a board that's in their department, where people can kind of almost vote anonymously and kind of share their thoughts on things. So, or like a Dropbox or something where people might be able to share ideas or feedback. So those are some suggestions, I think, to make that a really helpful, positive, successful conversation for both leaders and for team members.
So as you opened this, and I love those suggestions around how to gather feedback. So it doesn't have to be like get everybody into a room and then stare at each other until somebody finally raises their hand and says, it'd be great if we could fix this or we could do that, right? I mean, that's the traditional, like, I don't know, TV drama version of how company meetings go. But, kind of your idea of starting a Slack channel where everybody can kind of chime in and say, here's what we want to see improve, or a physical wall of suggestions. That's a really great way to take immediate action, kind of finite steps and immediate actions. One of the things that you had mentioned at the top was when these programs are put into place. So whether it's we're going to have a cork board where we're going to put up, sticky notes and vote, or we're going to sit down and have a more formal discussion about things, developing an action plan so everybody's really clear on outcomes and next steps is one of the major success criteria. And you kind of hit on that at the top. So how would you recommend either team members or managers even checking in after the fact and kind of getting a status update or ensuring that the focus stayed on the commitments that were laid out? What would you suggest, or what have you seen work well in those scenarios?
What comes to mind for me is like a follow-up, whether it's kind of another quick pulse of something, like maybe it's even just a thumbs up, thumbs down, middle thumbs, just a way to revisit after, I'd say maybe 90 days or a set period of time. And I think that can be something that's decided on together as a team. Like, we're going to try this out and totally game to try it out. Let's revisit and see how it's going. I think that can be done in a similar way of kind of how you gathered feedback initially at the organization that I worked at. that was another kind of a follow-up, like every 6 months there was like another big survey that asked some of the same questions to measure that response, for people's experience and how they're responding to those questions like 6 months later. So I think that's the best practice, is to have uh, engagement surveys, whatever that, people engagement
Mhm.
surveys in whatever form that is. I mean, there are large, expensive ways to measure engagement with great, amazing benchmark data. Um, some of those systems are kind of clunky, in my opinion, in terms of the back end and how you get the data and how people get access to it. And that doesn't really help, I think, the effort. But I don't think it has to be, for many places that are small businesses, leaders that might have small teams, entrepreneurs potentially, or maybe just growing teams. Like, it might not be the full blown employee engagement survey, super formal, at this set cadence. But however you're measuring it, even if that's internally with a quick, some polling questions where you're just measuring with your team, um, be it in Slack or some other form of communication, like, I'm just gathering feedback. I think it doesn't have to be as complicated as this huge formal benchmark data. You can be your own benchmark data, and that can be a lot more simple of a process, to gather that feedback. What's important is that you're doing it, you're asking people about their experience. What's important is that you're being really intentional with what you're asking, and what's important is what you do with it in that conversation with your people.
Thank you for that succinct answer. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the multi-generation environment that we have in the workplace. So you mentioned that you work in healthcare. You talked a little bit about hospitals as well. So that very easily probably has every single generation under the sun working right now, between interns that are still in college or med school, all the way through the doctors that are very close to retirement or maybe don't want to retire because they have been working there for so long. And engagement can look very different across that generational divide. And I would say that most workplaces and most organizations today are adapting a little bit to having 3, 4, or 5 generations all working together. From an engagement standpoint, when you're trying to combine those sorts of groups that have different working styles and different priorities, and I would even wager, because I've been in some environments, that some generations think that engagement is baloney because they're paid to do something, and so they should just everybody should just do it and not talk about it. What have you seen, and what do you recommend for people that are working in environments where there's multiple generations and are trying to navigate these waters?
That is a really, really good question, and is definitely a challenge. The thing that comes to my mind is definitely, I mean, there are different demographics represented in every group's population. Moms, not moms, married, not married. So generation is one of those. So a couple of things that I think are important. One is understanding in your data, like, we're talking about data collection. Yes, it's as simple as asking questions about people's experience, but really understanding who are those people and how are they responding. Like, the data collection of that is really important. So I would say that's something to be proactive about when you're setting up whatever forum it is in which you're collecting that data. Even something as simple as like Microsoft Forms or SurveyMonkey, these very simple solutions that you don't have to work with, be on contract with some large survey company. Regardless of whatever forum you're collecting the data, proactively thinking about, how am I going to know um, like which groups these fall into, and that's really critical from a data analysis standpoint on the back end so that you can understand what are some of the nuances. And I'm getting this feedback from people. So what's different about the way that people from this generation respond to this question versus this other generation, or whatever demographic it is, if it's not generation. So being proactive about that in your setup of your data collection is really critical. And I think another, like, I'll put like a little caveat to that, which is anonymity is important. And that is very much something that I regularly hear from frontline team members, is concern about this not being anonymous, and that there being, retaliation, and I might be receiving negative consequences for regardless of how I share. So sometimes the demographic stuff can be can kind of be a what's the word I'm looking for? Can kind of signify perhaps, or give clues to who might have answered something. So being also mindful of that's a positive for working with some of these larger companies, is they own the data and they have strict rules in terms of how the data is shared and displayed, specifically like in groups of 5 or more, something like that. So anywho, I wanted to share that because I think that that's one thing that can be helpful when it comes to figuring out what are people experiencing at various, ages in my employee group or my people group. The other thing I wanted to mention is I think that it's personal, like just collecting data of your people group, I don't think is enough. When we're talking about employee and employer, employee to leader relationship, I really think that there needs to be a little bit more personalization to that. So in my opinion, the solution to challenges in the workplace, or perhaps different preferences about things based on generational differences, is just really like getting a leader should be getting curious about that. A leader should be having conversations to better understand what's contributing to that, or what the different perspectives are, kind of, what's contributing to you having this perspective or seeing this situation in one way versus someone else. And when it comes to like preferences regarding, remote work comes to mind. I think that those are personal solutions that have to be met kind of with the leader and the employee. I really don't think that any one person is the same in what they need or want, even amongst generations. Like, I just don't think that we can put people in buckets and say that every person that's a millennial wants to work remotely. I don't know that that's true. I think we really need to find out from our teams and getting to know people. So yeah, that's my perspective on how to navigate that.
Yeah. Well, and that's, one of the reasons conversations are so important, right? And feedback is so important, getting to know the people that you work with and that you work for and that you work around, because being in conversation, you start to understand what motivates them and incentivizes them. You and I, when we met a couple of weeks ago, talked a bit about recognition. So how does that play into this broader topic of engagement? Does recognition have a role to play? And if so, what is it?
Recognition absolutely has a role to play. When you think about the big question is, how engaged are my employees, or how engaged are my people? That's the huge, humongous question. For every single individual person, there is, probably thousands of factors that are influencing whether or not their level of engagement at your organization. Recognition is one of those. Am I appreciated? Am I seen? Am I receiving recognition for the achievements? It's not the only thing. Communication is huge in terms of leadership communication, organization communication. I know where we're headed. Yeah, I know what the vision is. I see myself as part of that. So leadership relationships, the employee's relationship to the organization and its mission and their alignment with that. It's this very complicated. If you think about your own personal work life, or even your opt-in to whatever organization, there are so many factors for you personally that are influencing whether or not you want to opt in to an organization, to a job. And so recognition fits in as one of those, factors. Like, I think about it like a diamond, and there's all these different angles and pieces to it, ways to look at it. And every person is different in the way that they're answering even all the same questions. Everyone's being asked the same questions, but they're all answering them differently based on different things in their own personal experience. So to answer your question, I definitely think recognition and appreciation is a big part of building engagement. It's not the only part of building engagement. And that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, and having unique solutions for the people around you, right? So it's not a one size fits all. When companies decide that giving everybody a hoodie is going to make everything all better, or you get your holiday Christmas Yeti mug and some candy, it's not going to resonate with everybody. It's going to fall flat for some. And so understanding who you're working with and what really incentivizes them or motivates them. I think you've been very consistent with the theme that it's having a depth of knowing and understanding what drives and motivates people, how to get them engaged, how to recognize them. And so if you are somebody looking for a job today, so if you're out there interviewing and you're talking to companies and you know that one of your priorities is to be in a culture where everybody is really energized by the mission and engaged and taking, I think you used the word discretionary action, kind of actively within the company. As you're interviewing for roles in different companies, what sort of questions could you ask, or examples could you ask for? Is the one that's looking for the job, what could you ask of a future employer or manager to get kind of a pulse check on what engagement looks like before you say yes and sign all the paperwork and show up and then go, oh boy, not what I was expecting? What can you do in advance of that?
I think that's a really good question. I think at a very basic level, asking about their employee recognition program. So if you're interviewing for a job, it is very likely that there is probably some sort of defined recognition program. Like this is how we recognize employees. So I think that would be kind of telling, actually, to just ask, tell me a little bit about your employee recognition program. If they don't know what that is, we don't have one. I think that's kind of interesting, but also just asking them to describe, how do you recognize employees on this team? What does that look like? You could even ask, like, when was the last time you recognized somebody on this team and what was that for? I'd be curious at those kinds of questions to get an idea. I mean, most of the time when you're interviewing for a role, especially in a larger corporate organization, you're really interviewing for the people that you're going to be working alongside directly. And typically that's not a humongous team. I guess it kind of depends a bit on the industry, perhaps, and certainly the organizational structure. But the people that you're going to be working alongside is really understanding how they're showing appreciation to one another is really important. And then I think it is important to ask about what's the organization's strategy and approach to doing this. And if there's nothing defined, then I think that's telling. The other thing that I think also goes into kind of the umbrella of recognition is not necessarily just recognition and rewards, but how do you celebrate things together? Mm-hmm. How do you celebrate achievements and success? Employee milestones like tenure and years of service, and how are people recognized for those types of achievements, you could ask about those sort of things too.
Those are great suggestions. So thank you so much. And I prepped you a little in advance for some closing questions. So I think you had some time to do some homework. So, as I said, Becca's our first guest. So she was willing to play ball with me. And I'm going to ask all of our guests the same questions as we close out the podcast. So she's going to be our first guinea pig. We'll see how it goes. But she's a willing participant. So the first thing that I want to ask you is, what is the best advice that you ever received?
Okay, I'm thinking. There's a lot, I feel like, to distill.
That's
actually
good.
In that I've received a lot of good advice and definitely take away a lot of things from people that I've worked for and worked with and look up to. So the thing that's coming to mind is I think it's actually a quote. I'm not so sure that it's advice, and I don't even know if that I have the quote exactly right. But it's something along the lines of like, the problem with communication is the assumption that it's been achieved. I think is that what it is? Something like that. So I think what I'm trying to get at is communication is really important in understanding expectations and it being clear and concise. So I guess the advice that's coming to mind for me is just making sure that communication is done clearly and with the right people. That's been something that I've long since tried to utilize, I think, that advice in my career. And making sure that there's no assumptions as far as like, oh, they already know, that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So on the flip
Yeah.
side then, what's the worst advice that you've ever received?
So here's what's coming to mind. I think the worst advice, or the worst lesson, I suppose, I've seen or displayed, me personally, is like trying to please everyone and trying to not like ruffle any feathers, like just being like a yes kind of person all the time. That has a negative repercussions on the people around you, because oftentimes you're pulling other people into all of those yeses and into all of that kind of like people pleasing. So I think just that's what comes to mind as worst advice, especially as a leader or a growing leader, being able to say no. And so the worst advice would be never being able to say no. I think that is not a good approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. People really struggle with saying no also. So it's a skill that has to be learned. All right. So we're going to pivot and you're going to be the advice giver. So to a new employee on her first day of work outside of college, what advice would you give her?
The advice that I would give her is build relationships with the people that you work with. For, I think, maybe the first, at least a week of my first job outside of college, I ate lunch outside by myself. And this was a pretty tight-knit HR team that ate lunch together. I wasn't exactly invited to join them in lunch, or maybe I was, but felt sort of like, oh, they're just doing that. And so I specifically remember I sat on this little short cement wall and ate lunch by myself. And a coworker, a couple of years later, maybe even more like a decade later, it probably wasn't a couple of years, I worked with her for a long time, but she said, I actually remember that. And she perceived that I was really stuck up for not joining them. for lunch, especially just initially. It didn't last very long. I think eventually I got to know them better. So my advice would just be really intentional about that. You're not at work to be best friends with everyone by any means. It's important for that to remain professional, and I think you need to read the room a
Mm-hmm.
little bit in terms of how close or buddy or friendly. Sometimes people want a little bit more space. So, but knowing, like, thinking long term about those very first decisions that you might make in the first even couple of weeks of a brand new role fresh out of college, many of those people might be people that you'll work with for a really long time. And first impressions are really important. And so, um, thinking, just kind of putting on that long-term cap and what happens here in these first couple of weeks, and the way I respond or the choices that I make may actually really be creating a lasting impression for other
Mm-hmm.
people. And thankfully, I think that I was able to work through any of those negative perceptions over time. But that's probably one of the regrets I might have, just from initial, first few days as a big girl professional.
I think we all always make mistakes. I had one manager that I worked for, and she said to me once, be nice to everybody because you never know who your next boss is going to be. And about 5 years later, I was her boss. So I've like it
Yeah.
always sat with me a little bit that you just never know when the tables are going to turn or whose paths you're going to cross again. So I think that that's really sound. It's really, really sound advice. So I have one more question for you. This is the big one, that's very opaque. But Becca, what will your legacy be at the end of your career?
What will my legacy be at the end of my career? To me, what comes to mind is really having a care for people, both those that I work with and both those that I serve. A care for them. I would love for that to be my legacy. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is the legacy that you balance between taking risks and making changes, and, like, staying challenging yourself to stay and become an expert and become really knowledgeable and a trusted resource. So I'm not exactly sure how to summarize that in one little thing, but I guess maybe just maybe my legacy would be, like, yeah, caring for people throughout the work that I do, and also, I guess, just being really intentional. I would say with my choices, and when I made those and when I didn't. So yeah, doing the things that are right for me when that time comes.
Well, based on the little bit of your life that I have seen thus far, I think you're well on your way to achieving that. So I'm really grateful you spent time with me today and you got to talk to the community. And I have learned something about people engagement. I'm going to stop saying employee engagement now, Becca. We're going to change the narrative. So if people want to connect with you outside of this podcast, where is the best place for them to find you and connect?
The best place to find me is on LinkedIn. That is really the only social media that I'm actively using these days. So I would love to connect there if people are interested in doing that.
Fantastic. And we'll have all that information in the show notes so you can find Becca there and connect. And Becca, I want to thank you for your time today. Listeners, as always, we're going to end with our catchphrase: you're wise, you're strong, and you're capable. And I believe in you. Until next time, friends, have a really great week.